Push open the heavy oak door. It's a damp evening in England. The year is 1340. Smoke hits you first, thick, woody, clinging to your hair before you've even stepped inside. The light is dim, flickering off rough plaster walls and low blackened beams. Voices blur into a single low roar. It's loud, it's cramped, and it smells like wood smoke, sweat, and boiled meat. You squeeze onto a bench at a long wooden table. You wait for your meal, but nobody brings you a plate. Because in 1340, your plate is something you're going to eat. In the next 15 minutes, you and I are going to sit down at this table and walk through a full medieval meal. Every bite, every sip, every secret of the smoky room around us. By the end, you'll know exactly what an ordinary dinner in 1340 England really looked, smelled, and tasted like. And trust me, at least one thing on this table is going to surprise you. Before we sit down, hit that subscribe button. We recreate lost worlds like this every week in stunning AI-powered 4K. You don't want to miss what's coming. Now, let's eat. The innkeeper drops something heavy in front of you. It looks like a thick, square slab of bread. Dark, dense, already stale. This isn't a side. This isn't a starter. This is your plate. It's called a trencher, and it's about to change how you think about medieval dining forever. This bread is nothing like the soft white loaf you'd grab from a supermarket today. It's coarse, baked from a rough mix of rye and barley, sometimes with a little oats thrown in. In many villages, this blend had a name, maslin, a practical loaf for people who couldn't afford fine wheat. Pick it up and you'd notice. It's gray-brown and freckled with bran. It's so dense that tearing it takes real effort. It was baked hard on purpose, then left to go stale, because soft bread couldn't survive what's about to happen to it. Here's something fascinating. In medieval England, the color of your bread was basically a label for your income. The darker and rougher the loaf, the poorer the eater. Laborers ate almost gray bread. Townsfolk and merchants got lighter, finer loaves. Nobles ate snow-white wheat bread, carefully sifted and ferociously expensive. You could literally tell a person's social class by glancing at their lunch. Your trencher tonight has a job to do before it becomes food. It's been sliced flat and square, set in front of you like a wooden board, and in a moment, your steaming dinner is going to be heaped right on top of it. As you eat, the juices, the fat, the gravy, all of it soaks down into the crumb. By the end of the meal, this once stale brick has transformed into something rich, heavy, and packed with flavor. So what happens to it then? If you're not too poor, you eat the trencher yourself. Soggy, savory, the perfect final course. On busier nights, the soaked trenchers are collected in baskets and handed out to the hungry people waiting outside the door. Either way, nothing is wasted. The plate is really just stored calories, a backup ration, a way to squeeze one more meal out of the same dinner. This wasn't a quirky medieval gimmick. It was brilliant problem solving. In a world without cheap pottery, paper plates, or dishwashers, edible tableware was efficient, practical, and zero waste. Quick question for you. Would you eat your plate at the end of dinner or pass it to the people waiting outside? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm genuinely curious. Now look toward the fire. There it is, the real heart of this tavern. A single massive iron pot, blackened with soot, hanging over the flames. That pot has been cooking for days. Not literally the same serving, but the same ongoing mixture. Every single day, water is topped up. New ingredients tumble in. Yesterday's additions keep breaking down into the broth. Inside is pottage, the everyday food of medieval England. For roughly 4 out of every 5 people in this country, dinner means this: a thick, slow-evolving stew of legumes and whatever else was around. The base almost never changes. Dried peas, beans, or lentils. They're cheap. They store forever. They fill you up. And they're one of the most important sources of protein for ordinary people. Around that core goes whatever the season offers: turnips, parsnips, and other root vegetables, cabbage or seasonal greens, onions and leeks, almost always on hand, handfuls of herbs straight from the kitchen garden. Some days the pottage is thin enough to drink from a cup. Other days it cools into something you could almost slice with a knife. And meat. For most people, meat in pottage is more of a memory than a main event. You might find a chunk of bacon rind, a scrap of salted pork, a bone left over from some long-ago feast. That little piece of meat simmers for hours, sometimes days, until every drop of salt and fat has leached into the broth. You're not getting a steak. You're getting flavor passed slowly through the pot and into the humble peas and turnips. Here's the wild part. The pot is rarely scrubbed out and started over. That would waste precious firewood and time. So instead, it's a continuous, living project, fed daily, shared by the household or the tavern, always on the edge of a simmer. When you buy a bowl of pottage, you're joining a long chain of people who have eaten from that exact same pot. Sometimes the same day, sometimes stretching back weeks. Not glamorous, but it was. Nutritionally dense, endlessly flexible, designed to stretch every scrap into one more meal. When people today picture medieval meat, they imagine a whole roasted boar with an apple in its mouth, surrounded by cheering nobles in a great hall. Your reality in 1340 is closer to a barrel in a storeroom. Fresh meat was a tiny window of abundance. Animals were slaughtered when winter was coming and fodder ran low, or when cold weather would slow spoilage. The moment that animal hit the ground, the clock started ticking. Meat had to be preserved fast, or it was lost. So it was, packed in heavy salt, smoked over open fires, dried into tough, leathery strips. By the time meat reached your bowl, most of what you were eating had been dead for weeks or months. Here's what that actually looked like at the table. Salted pork and bacon were the backbone of everyday meat. Usually too salty to eat directly, they were soaked in water for hours, then used to flavor pottage rather than served as big chunks. Beef was valuable. Cows were more useful alive, for milk and labor. So if you got beef at all, it was probably preserved and chewy. Unless you were eating in a wealthy household or it was a feast day. Poultry, usually tough old hens past their laying years, was boiled for hours until finally tender enough to chew. Forget the cartoonish image of giant roast chicken legs. Boiled fowl is far closer to the truth. Pigeons and small birds were surprisingly common. Many estates kept dovecotes, purpose-built pigeon houses, supplying a steady stream of young squab for pies and roasts. Then there's game, rabbits, deer, wild birds. Technically, a lot of this belonged to the lord or the crown. Poaching was illegal and seriously risky, but of course it still happened. For some peasants, an illegal rabbit was a rare and delicious secret. And finally, the giant of medieval protein, herring. Barrels upon barrels of small fish, salted or dried, were shipped inland from coastal towns. Why? Because the medieval church required people to avoid meat for huge stretches of the year. Every Friday, all of Lent, and dozens of fast days in between. Preserved fish filled that gap perfectly. Cheap, storable, transportable. The taste, brutally salty, endlessly repetitive. To make it tolerable, people soaked it for hours, cooked it with onions and herbs, or, if hungry enough, just pulled it straight from the barrel and chewed. So forget the dramatic roasted boar. Medieval meat was really a year-long strategy for moving salt, fat, and protein through a long, cold winter. There's a stubborn modern myth that medieval food was dull. Boiled everything, no flavor, gray mush on a wooden board. I want you to lean over that bowl of pottage in front of you. Take a real spoonful. You would not call this flavorless. Think about what we've seen so far. Brutally salty meat and fish, monotonous staples like peas and cabbage, heavy, fat-rich broths. If you're eating that every day, flavor isn't optional. Flavor is the only thing keeping you sane. Medieval cooks didn't shrug and serve plain mush. They went to war with 4 weapons. Weapon 1, intense aromatics. Onions, leeks, and garlic appeared in nearly every savory dish. Cheap, hearty, easy to grow, easy to store. They built a sharp, punchy base that cut straight through fat and salt. Weapon 2, herbs by the handful. Parsley, sage, thyme, fennel, hyssop. Medieval recipes are often frustratingly vague. They just say add herbs, because everyone already knew the answer was a lot. These weren't dainty garnishes. They were thrown in by the fistful. Weapon 3. Sharp, acidic notes. Medieval England used verjuice, the sour juice of unripe grapes or crab apples, the same way we use lemon today. Splashed over cooked meats, stirred into sauces, used to brighten heavy stews. And then there was mustard, seeds ground fresh with verjuice or vinegar, spread thick on bread or pork, strong enough to slice straight through greasy salted meat. Weapon 4. Imported spices. For wealthy households, this was the ultimate flex. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, all carried along long-distance trade routes at enormous cost. A small spice box on a noble's table was a medieval status symbol, the equivalent of parking a luxury car in your driveway. It seasoned the food, sure, but it also screamed, "I am rich." Even for ordinary people, local flavoring was deliberate, intense, and creative. The goal was simple: make repetition livable. You reach for something to wash all this down. Whatever you do, and do not ask for water. In 1340, people didn't know what bacteria were. But after centuries of painful trial and error, they knew one thing for sure: drinking untreated water could absolutely kill you. So they found a workaround that became nearly universal. Ale. But this is not modern beer. Forget everything you know. It's weak, usually only 2 to 3% alcohol. It's brewed without hops, which weren't yet common in England. It's cloudy, unfiltered, and sometimes closer to a thin, drinkable porridge than the crisp pint you'd order today. Because it spoiled fast, ale had to be brewed constantly. The local alewife, and yes, brewing was largely women's work in this era, made small batches every few days. When a fresh batch was ready, she'd hang a bundle of greenery or a long pole outside her door. That was the signal. Fresh ale, come and get it before it sours. Men, women, and children all drank ale because it was safer than most water. It packed extra calories into a hard-working day. It was available almost everywhere. For those with money, wine showed up near ports and in richer households, usually rough by modern standards, often mixed with water or sweetened with honey. Mead made from fermented honey still existed, especially in rural areas, but it had faded compared to earlier centuries. But in the tavern where you're sitting, ale is king. It hums in the background of every conversation, fuels every deal, and rinses down every last trencher crumb. After your pottage and your soaked bread plate, you might be handed something small but special. A classic choice, Frumenty. It's made from whole or cracked wheat grains, simmered gently in milk or broth, thickened sometimes with egg yolks, sweetened with honey, and in wealthier settings, scented with cinnamon or saffron. The result is rich, porridge-like, dense, and comforting. It can blur the line between savory and sweet, especially when served alongside meat. Other sweet touches you might get: dried figs and raisins, imported but not impossibly rare, eaten in small amounts or baked into pies. Honey, the everyday sweetener of the age, drizzled or stirred into anything that needed lifting. Sugar existed, but in 1340 it was closer to a luxury spice than a pantry staple. Wildly expensive, used sparingly, and mostly reserved for noble showpieces called subtleties. Elaborate sugar sculptures designed for spectacle, not nutrition. For most ordinary people, sweetness at the end of a hard day might be just a spoonful of Frumenty, a handful of raisins, or a smear of honey on bread. Small, but unforgettable. Now put your spoon down, lean back. Look around the room. This tavern isn't just a place to eat. For most ordinary people, it's the only public space they'll ever regularly use in their entire lives. And it does everything. News spreads here. A pilgrim heading to Canterbury repeats what he heard 3 towns back. A trader from a coastal port mentions rumors of sickness or new taxes. A farmer from the next county talks about a failed harvest, or a surprisingly good one. Work is arranged here. A mason looking for building jobs lingers by the fire. A merchant who needs someone to move wool asks around the room. Deals are sealed with a handshake and a few witnesses at the next table. Disputes are settled here. Neighbors argue over land boundaries, unpaid debts, broken promises. Respected elders weigh in. Oaths are sworn in front of the whole room. Religion shows up here too. A traveling preacher might stop and speak. Parish gossip flies thick. Ideas about right and wrong get chewed over with the same seriousness as the bread and pottage. And of course, entertainment. Storytellers, singers, traveling musicians, dice games and gambling, often illegal and always thrilling. Gossip, jokes, tall tales told and retold. This is theater before public theaters existed for common people. To sit at this table, to eat from the shared pot, is to plug into the social network of medieval life. The price of entry? Your meal, your drink, and your time. Class still mattered. Everyone knew exactly who was higher or lower in status. But for one evening, the pilgrim, the merchant, and the plowman sat on the same bench, ate from the same pot, drank the same ale. Information, favors, and warnings flowed across class lines in a way they almost never did in a lord's hall or a church pew. So here's a real question for you. If you could time travel and spend one evening at this tavern, who would you most want to sit next to? The pilgrim, the merchant, or the plowman? Tell me in the comments. The answers might surprise you. You drain the last of your ale. The trencher is gone, eaten down to the last gravy-soaked crust. The pottage pot bubbles on, waiting for the next stranger to push open that heavy door. You stand up with more than a full stomach. You know which roads are flooded. You've heard the tax collectors are coming early this year. You know the harvest failed in one region and thrived in another. The food pulled you in. The tavern, its warmth, its noise, its network, kept you there. Now strip away the Maslin trencher, the eternal pottage, the barrels of herring. What's left? Something deeply, surprisingly familiar, coming in from the cold and wet, sitting down somewhere safe, wrapping your hands around something hot, sharing food and talk with other people in the same room. Our world today is separated from 1340 by enormous leaps in technology, medicine, hygiene, comfort. But the core experience, seeking warmth, food, and human connection after a hard day, hasn't moved an inch in 700 years. Back then, comfort looked like dark, dense bread doing double duty as a plate, a stew pot that never quite emptied, salted meat tamed with herbs and patience, weak, cloudy ale safer than the well water, a smoky, crowded room humming with rumor, deals, and laughter. Today, it looks like a bowl of ramen, a takeaway pizza, a mug of hot chocolate on the sofa, different ingredients, different tools, the same human need, a hot meal, a safe seat, and the feeling, for just a little while, that you're sheltered, fed, and not alone. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of curious mind this channel is built for. We bring lost worlds back to life in stunning AI-powered 4K, from forgotten civilizations to dark historical secrets the textbooks left out. Hit subscribe, smash that like button if you enjoyed sitting at this medieval table with me, and tell me in the comments, what era should we step inside next? Ancient Rome? Viking Norway? The streets of Plague-era London? You pick. We rebuild it. The door's already open. I'll see you in the next one.